This is chapter 13, lecture number 2. In this section, we're going to look at some of our neural pools. What does that mean? That means the way that neurons send information. Sometimes it's one neuron to a second neuron to a third neuron. They kind of do it in a row. Sometimes it's one neuron that will contact a whole bunch of neurons, which will send signals down several neurons. So they just have different configurations of how they can send information, and we call that neural pools. We're also going to look at reflexes. So neural pools, it's important to know that a neural pool is basically the organization of the groups of neurons. So again, one neuron talks to another neuron, or it may have a little bit different configuration where one talks to multiple. The 5 patterns of neural circuits are divergence, convergence, serial processing, parallel processing, and reverberating. So I'm going to look at each of these neural pool types. The first one is divergence. This is where we have a neuron that's sending some kind of a signal, and it splits, and at that point it's like a diverge. When we come to a split in the road, we diverge, we go our different ways. So at this point the neural signal comes down. It's going to send one signal down this neural pathway, one signal down this neural pathway. So this is an example of divergence. Convergence is where I have a whole bunch of neurons sending multiple types of information into a postsynaptic single neuron. These guys are converging in the road. They're coming together. So this would be an example of convergence right here. Serial processing. This is where we have one neuron sends it to the next neuron that sends it to the next neuron. So this is kind of a single file path in serial processing. And then parallel processing is where we would have 2 neurons sending kind of like information side by side, and they're sending that information to multiple neurons at the postsynaptic area. So this allows us to process a lot of information simultaneous. And then finally we have reverberating, which is a positive feedback loop. So we send a signal down to a postsynaptic neuron, which sends it on to an effector, but it also sends a signal back to the presynaptic neuron and says, hey, keep sending this signal. So it keeps sending a signal to keep sending the signal, which also sends it down to the final destination, which would be some kind of an effector. So let's talk about where would we see these. So divergence would be when we would see information coming in that we need to tell a whole bunch of people about. This is pretty common when we have incoming sensory information. So we have incoming sensory information from some receptor, and it's going to spread that information and talk to lots of neurons to pass that information along simultaneously. We would see convergence when we were sending information from multiple sources. So one example might be sending a signal to the diaphragm for breathing. We can send both subconscious and conscious information to the diaphragm to make the diaphragm either speed up, because we can conscientiously speed up our respiratory rate, which would be affecting our diaphragm. But there are times where we can't control our diaphragm at all. It's going to move at a rate that our body needs to bring oxygen in. So that would be an example of when we would see convergence. Serial processing is a very common type we see with pain. We're going to send some sensation of pain along its path to where it needs to go to relay that information. And parallel processing we would see kind of with reflexive things. So if we say we stepped on a tack, if all of our weight is on the foot that we stepped on, we have to send multiples pathways of information. One, to tell us to pick our foot up off of the tack, but we also have to send information to the other leg so that it is prepared to take the weight from when we pull our other foot up. So parallel processing is the kind of information where you're giving signals to multiple places in the body. One might be contracting, one might be reflexing away from some sort of pain or stimulus. And then reverberating. This would be a positive feedback loop if we need to keep something going. We need to continue moving. We see this kind of signal where maybe maintaining consciousness. You send a signal to keep staying awake, and you're also sending the signal down to effectors that are affected by that. Okay, we're going to talk about reflexes. With reflexes, there's some terms that you need to know. First of all, we're going to have some sort of a sensory receptor. A receptor is the thing that's picking up a signal. The second thing is a sensory neuron. Our sensory neuron is picking up information from the receptor and it's sending it into the central nervous system. At the central nervous system, we're going to process that information. We're going to send information out the motor neuron to some sort of an effector. The effector is the guy that's going to do the moving based on the information that came in. So here's a reflex arc. Here's number one. We get some sort of stimulus. In this particular example, we leaned on a tack. So we're going to send a pain signal. Pain signal is going to come into the dorsal horns. So remember, dorsal horns are incoming sensory information. This happens to be something that we have conscious control over. So this would be incoming somatic sensory information. So it's going to land in that mapped area of the spinal cord. At this point, our information just has to come into the central nervous system. Remember, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. So in a reflex, we want it to be quick because we're going to be moving quickly. So we don't have to wait for information to come in, then go all the way to the brain, then come back down from the brain and say, move your hand. So what it does is it comes into the spinal cord and it sends information about how to move. And then it also sends a signal up to the spinal cord. So by the time your cerebrum becomes conscious that you've already moved your hand. So again, we leaned on a tack. This was our effector. This was our receptor who picked up the information. It sends the information down the dorsal root, comes in the posterior horn, lands on the somatic portion of the spinal cord, somatic sensory information. It synapses, so it passes it to an interneuron. So this is my go-between neuron, who sends it to the motor horns. And this is somatic motor because it's controlling my skeletal muscles. So it lands on the anterior horn where it synapses with another neuron that comes out and says, hey, move your hand. So the skeletal muscles moves. This interneuron also sends a signal up to the brain. So again, the brain becomes aware of what went on down here, but by the time the brain becomes aware of it, we've already moved. This saves your body because if this was an attack and say we were touching a hot stove, we would want to move our hand off the hot stove as quickly as we can, and it goes very fast. But if you thought about if we had to wait for it to go up to the brain and then come back down to say move your hand, you'd have a lot more damage than you would if we move it and then tell the brain what happened. So this is a reflex arc. In this case, we contacted our skeletal muscles, which contracted our bicep, which pulled our hand off the tack. We have 4 types of reflexes. These are development, motor response, complexity of neural circuit, and the site of information processing. Our somatic reflexes are going to control skeletal muscles. So anytime we're talking about somatic, we're talking about skeletal muscles. So we have superficial reflexes. We have stretch or deep tendon reflexes. This would be where the doctor bangs your knee with a hammer and you jerk your leg. That is your tendon saying, hey, I have too much stretch on my tendon, and it contracts your femur muscles so that you take the stretch off of your tendon at that area. And then we also have immediate ones, like if you slip, you cut a finger, things like that, you're going to move your skeletal muscles to correct whatever's going on. Visceral reflexes are going to be autonomic. These are things we don't have control over. These are going to be smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, glands. And this shows developmental. These are innate. These are things that you get from genetics. We have acquired. These are learned reflexes. We have somatic, which are skeletal muscle things. Visceral, which are internal organs we don't have control over. If we go into complexity of circuit, we can have monosynaptic, which means we only have 2 neurons. It comes from one neuron to a second neuron. That would be our synapse point, and then it goes back out to the effector. We can have polysynaptic. This is where we might have, like the one example we looked at with the TAC, we might have one neuron coming in, it'll synapse to an interneuron, which can send it to lots of different areas, and then it synapses again out to our effector. And then our processing site. Some of our reflexes are processed at the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system. We looked at an example of that. We can also have cranial reflexes, and this would be where they're processed in the brain. And an example of a cranial reflex is you hear a loud bang, you turn and you look at it. So that would be an example of a cranial reflex. So here's the stretch reflex. This would be monosynaptic. So here we have a stimulus. We get our patellar tendon banged with a hammer. This sends sensory information in. It goes all the way up to the motor portion where it synapses and it says, hey, contract this muscle and take the pressure off this tendon. So that would be a monosynaptic stretch reflex. This would be a withdrawal reflex, and you can see it's going to have polysynaptic. It has more than one synapse. So we touch something hot, so our sensory information comes in our dorsal horn, synapses on the dorsal horns to an interneuron, one sends it up to the brain. One portion goes to our flexors, which say flex your arm away, but in order to flex our arm away, we have to relax our extensors. So we have another synapse that says relax these muscles, flex these muscles. And so this would be a withdrawal polysynaptic. And then here's a crossed extensor reflex. Here we're stepping on something painful. Our sensory information comes in our dorsal horns. We have a synapse here. We send that information up to the brain, so the brain ends up knowing what's going on here. We send a signal down the same side that says, hey, flex this muscle, relax this muscle, which is going to pull our foot off the tack. But this leg over here has to be prepared to take the body weight. So at this synapse, we're going to send it across to the other side of the body. And we're going to say, hey, contract these extensors, relax these flexors. So all of our weight now goes on this foot and allows us to pull this foot up. So this is a pretty complex crossed extensor reflex. And then the last two reflexes you should know is a plantar reflex, which is normal in adults. This is where if we stroke the sole of the foot, it causes toe curling. That's called a plantar reflex. With a baby, they do the opposite, and it's called Babinski's reflex. So if we stroke the bottom of a baby's foot, they'll actually pull their toes up instead of curling towards that. If adults have that, that is indicative of some spinal cord damage. And here's a picture. Here's an adult. We stroke that, toes flex down. Babinski's on a baby. We stroke it, toes flex away from it. So those are your reflexes from chapter 13.